Hey everybody, so today we're going to be making cinnamon rolls, just a classic recipe, good all the time, great for breakfast. It's a pretty easy recipe, takes about 6 hours to make, so let's get started. So for the first part of this recipe, we are going to be creaming together 5.5 tablespoons of butter, 6.5 tablespoons of sugar with 1 teaspoon of salt. After that's all creamed together, we're going to add in 1 egg and about a teaspoon of lemon zest. Once that's finally mixed, we are going to put in 3.5 cups of all-purpose flour, 1.25 cups of whole milk, and 2 teaspoons of instant yeast. Active dry or bread machine yeast, either of those work perfectly fine. And then for the filling, we are going to have 1/2 cup of sugar, 1.5 tablespoons of cinnamon, and 1/4 teaspoon of nutmeg. All right, so we have our butter at room temperature. What we're gonna do is we're gonna cream this with the salt and the sugar that we have. So I like to start out with a fork normally, just to kind of like make sure that there isn't any pieces that are still pretty cold and solid. So this one's pretty good and soft already. So just wanna start mixing this up a little bit, make sure it's all good. Then we're gonna take the salt, or sugar, that was the sugar. This is the salt. I'm gonna put the salt in. And then just gonna mix. You wanna do this a little slowly at first, just so you don't have a bunch of sugar and salt flying everywhere. Make sure that it gets incorporated into the butter. And then as it starts to get more mixed, then you can speed it up. You can do this in a KitchenAid if you want to. That makes it a lot easier to get it to the creamy consistency that you want. Sometimes if the fork's not working, or if you just want to use a whisk, I'm going to use a whisk just to see if it'll be a little bit easier. The reason I'm putting the towel under is so you guys don't have to hear the constant clacking of glass against the countertop. So you can see it's kind of getting a little bit fluffy, and this is kind of the texture that we're starting to look for. I'm going to do this a little bit more, but first I'm going to grab a little bit of a lighter whisk, just because this whisk is very solid and doesn't really bend as much. It doesn't allow me to get as much air in there, so using a lighter whisk will help with that. Yeah, that should be good. So from there, crack our egg in. Just like so. And then we're gonna take our lemon. And they said about a teaspoon of lemon zest. You can use a grater if you have a zester, even better. And this just helps get like a really nice like citrus brightness to something that would normally be really heavy and sugary. This kind of helps lighten that up. And I'm gonna mix this up. All right, now that we have that, what we wanna do, take our flour, pour it right on in. Yeast, and I actually like to kind of incorporate the yeast into the flour a bit before mixing it all up. And then our milk. If you don't have regular milk but you have powdered milk, you can use that. Just make sure you equate to about that level of 1.25 cups using powdered milk and water. I'm just gonna start folding this in. All right, we got a really nice wet dough here. So here's about the time where we start improvising a little bit. Let's get our bench scraper. our handy dandy bench scraper that we want to use all the time while baking. Since this is so wet, this is really, really sticky dough. We don't want it quite this sticky for cinnamon rolls. So here's where something that's supposed to be super precise becomes super imprecise. We're gonna add more flour. I'm not gonna measure it because every kitchen's gonna be different. You know, things like the weather, it's pretty humid here today. So that could be part of the reason why. And one mistake I made that you can avoid doing is you can start out with less milk at the start. So I put in 1 1/4 cups. If you want, you can put in 3/4 cups first, start mixing it, see how it combines. If it's too stiff of a dough, you can add a little bit more. And you want to just do that process iteratively. It's better to start with a little bit less so you can add more and not affect it. But you know what? I think this is still going to turn out pretty good. So we don't need to be precise. We're home bakers. Yeah, it's getting a lot better. It's still a little bit wet. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start kneading it right now and slowly add in little bits more flour. Because as you knead it, it's definitely going to change a lot in terms of texture. And this way you can control the amount of flour pretty easily. Because you constantly have this feel of how the dough is feeling. And right away, it is very wet. So we might be incorporating a lot more flour than we need to in this, or than we normally would, but that's how it goes sometimes. You just have to go with the flow. All right, so as you can see, after a good long while of kneading, the texture of the dough has changed drastically. This is why it's important to add little bits of flour at a time and err on the side of less flour than more. Because as I kneaded, the texture tightened up, it got a little bit less wet, a little bit less sticky, and now it's more of like a tacky dough, which is exactly what we want. So texture, like if you poke it and like kind of feel it, it's like pretty soft. You don't want to have it feel like it's stiff at all. And so if you've ever made bagels before, bagels is a really stiff dough. This is not what you want to be. This is more just like, you know, it should feel soft, taut, supple, and like fairly smooth and soft overall. So one thing that people say to check in order to check gluten development is to see if your dough passes the window pane test. And what they mean by that is what you do is you take a piece of dough and you want to stretch it out slowly and see if it gets to the point of being like almost see-through before it breaks. So I like to do it slow because obviously if you like take dough and pull it really fast, it's gonna rip, of course. but the key is to just like stretch it out little by little. And then I have a little bit of repping, but what they want to check is this like see-through kind of texture, so you can see like my finger on the other side like that. That's what they mean by the window pane test, is that's how it should look, just like that. Still solid, but my finger can see through it. Yeah, that's what hard work does for you. So now what we're gonna do is we're gonna take it, put it in a bowl. If you want, you can oil the bowl. Actually, that's a good idea. Gonna take some cooking spray, spray down the bowl. Take our dough, bring it in a nice little shape. Pull. Seam side down in the oil bowl. Gonna cover this with saran wrap and let it rest for about 2 hours, and then we're gonna roll it out, add the filling, and let it do the final rise. Hey guys, so this has been fermenting for about 2 hours now. As you can see, it's greatly increased in size, over double. So now it's time to roll it out and then fill it. So what we want, oh, love that. That was amazing. So here in this process, you want to incorporate as little flour as possible. So I'm just gonna like lightly dust the top, just so that when we roll it out, nothing sticks. Flip that over. Do the same for the other side. Just very light dusting of flour. You can add a little bit more. So what I like to do is I like to start shaping it with my hands a little bit first, just to get kind of a rectangular shape. I'm just kind of pulling, just like so. And you can start rolling it out with a rolling pin. If you don't have a rolling pin, that's okay. You can still accomplish quite a good amount by just pulling like I was doing so before. So we want to try and get mostly even shape. And one thing to do here is like, don't roll it out too much without reaching under, flipping it up, trying to move it around. If it feels like it's getting a little too sticky, then you can add some more flour underneath. But just kind of constantly move the dough around a little bit every so often as you're rolling it out, just so you make sure that you don't have one big chunk of it stuck to the counter. Just like so. Trying to get as best of a rectangular shape and as even as possible. But like I said, we're home bakers. We don't really care. So you don't want to have this too thin of a dough. That is one thing for sure. So if you want to be super specific, you can measure this out. I have this a little bit too long right now, actually. So because I have it too long, I'm just gonna kind of reach under, push it in, kind of push it back on top of itself. Just like let it rest a little after we get a proper size. So this is about 17 inches by 7.5. So if you want some larger cinnamon rolls, a good number to shoot for is about like 16 to 18 inches long, and then about 8 to 9 inches wide or so. So I'm just gonna kind of do this by hand, just kind of like shaping, pressing the dough down so that it's not literally just scrunched together, but actually sealed back together to get the shape that I want. And then if we check how thick it is, it's It's about 3/4 of an inch thick, so that's right about where we want it. So the reason you don't want it too thin is that if you have it too thin, then you're gonna end up with a really tough dough after you bake it. And it's not gonna be very light and airy or tender. All right, I'd say that's pretty good. Nice rough rectangular shape, pressing it down in. So then what we wanna do, take our cinnamon sugar mix, and we're gonna sprinkle it just all over the top. So you can do this by hand, you can do this by dumping the whole thing and spraying out with your hands. Doesn't really matter. Just try and get a good even coat. And it's fine if you have a lot, because a lot's gonna fall out when we cut it, and not all of it's gonna absorb in. So if you have too much, you'll see that like it doesn't really matter too much, because we're gonna press some in and we're going to cut it, and you'll see a bunch fall out. So I like to spread it out. I like to pat it in a little bit, just because if you pat it in, you ensure that at least some of the sugar is going to stick to the dough. Now what we're gonna do is just gonna start rolling it up. So I like to start just at one end, start rolling, and then as you go down, just keep that tucked under, make sure that that's staying. And then when you get to this end, just keep on going and start trailing your way back. And in this part, you don't want to be pulling the dough too much. Like, you don't want to stretch this part out. You're just like lightly rolling it onto itself so that you keep that same thickness that you had. So you're never really stretching the dough at all here. Here we go. Just like that. I like to keep that seam side down. And then what we want to do is cut it up into equal pieces. So you can start in the middle. If you really want to go specific, we can do this for the very specific people. This is 18 inches. So could just go half and half and half and half, or we could split it up to about a little less than 2 inches a piece. But you know what? I'm just gonna eyeball it because I don't really care that much. So now take a baking tray. I've lined this with a Silpat. If you don't have a Silpat, you can also use cooking oil, any sort of cooking spray. For the end pieces, I like to put it the end side down just because it's a little bit prettier. And I'm gonna put them on nicely spread apart. So I'm not gonna fit too many on each baking tray because I want them to cook well. Oh yeah. Wonderful. If you are someone who wants it to be very clean and not have this part open up at all, when we rolled it, you can go down the whole length and pinch the dough, just like so, onto itself, and you kind of create this little seal, and then you can have like a nice tight little cinnamon roll. I kind of like it where it might open up a little bit, makes it a little more rustic and kind of fun. So I'm gonna do it that way. Now we wanna cover these up in plastic wrap and let it rise again until it's about doubled in size. So we'll check back in about 40 minutes or so and see how this is going. I know what you're thinking. Are cinnamon rolls bread? Well, they have flour, water, yeast, and salt, so they have all the basic components of bread. But they add all this other stuff in it, and I don't really know if I should consider it bread or not. Well, the answer to that is it is bread, but it's an enriched bread. And by enriched, we mean we add all these extra ingredients and that changes the overall consistency, flavor, and texture of the final baked good that we're making. So for example, when you add things like sugar into your bread, what it does is it adds some extra coloration when you're baking it. So the sugar caramelizes when you're baking your bread, but you don't want it to caramelize too much, and that's why you see breads that contain sugar usually being baked at lower temperatures than breads that don't contain any sugar. That's because if you had a high temperature when you added sugar to your dough, what's going to happen is it's going to caramelize a lot on the outside of the dough, and you're going to get a really dark loaf, but the inside might not be cooked at all. So you want to control that by baking it at a lower temperature. And something else that you can add, fats, something like butter. So what butter does is, one, it adds a lot of flavor, and it also softens the bread. And by softening the bread, the technicalities of that are, well, let's think about what makes up normal bread. In normal bread, what gives it its texture is the gluten strands. You have all these gluten strands that are elongated and creating the structure and tension that you have so that the bread can rise properly and can also hold its structure very well and have a light and airy interior. When you're adding fats, what you're essentially doing is you're taking these fats that coat these gluten strands, and when they coat the gluten strands, they kind of like break up this tense, rigid structure that all the gluten strands are having. And what they're doing is just kind of making like basically everything slippery a little bit and making it a little bit softer, so you don't have as much of a structure as you would without any of the fats. Now, there are other things that you can add to make it an enriched bread, such as milk, and you can also add eggs. And both of these kind of do the similar things that fat and sugar does, because, well, both of these things just have about everything except for the eggs don't have as much sugar or any sugar as milk does, but both will do about the same. Actually, I need to go buy some more milk for the fondant glaze that we're going to make for our cinnamon rolls. Thanks for reminding me. All right, so I let these rest and rise for about almost an hour and a half now, and as you can see, they've doubled in size for sure. And a good way to tell that they're fully risen is if you poke one and it indents and doesn't pop back up, you know that it's fully risen. So what I'm gonna do is bake these at 350 degrees, and we're going to set a timer for about 20 minutes. And because I want to bake them at the same time, put one in on the top rack, one in on the bottom rack, and then I'm going to switch them 10 minutes into baking. All right, so these have been baking for about 10 minutes now, so I'm going to switch them and rotate them. As you can see, it's a good thing we put them as far apart as we did, because they are growing a lot. So I just give them a 180 turn, change shelves, and set the timer again for another 10 minutes. All right, so it's been another 10 minutes after turning, and we got some nice golden cinnamon rolls. Let's check these ones out. Yeah, these ones are looking a little bit pale to what I want. I'm gonna leave those in for another minute. All right, they're done baking. So that was 10 minutes, one on each rack, and then flipping racks and rotating the pans for another 10 minutes. That's a 20-minute total bake time. And we have this nice golden color. We're gonna let this cool in the pan for about 5 minutes and then transfer onto a wire rack for the rest of the cooling. So while the cinnamon rolls are cooling, we're gonna make our white fondant glaze, and that requires 4 cups of powdered sugar, about a half a cup or less of whole milk with 1/2 teaspoon of vanilla extract, and you wanna add just enough milk until it completely combines together. So what we're gonna do, add in our vanilla extract. What you want to make sure you do is not add too much milk to this. So slowly add about 1/4 of the amount in and start whisking. So this is a pretty stiff glaze right now, but there's no dry spots left. All the powdered sugar is dissolved. And you want to just make sure you break up any last clumps in there. So you should have a very thick consistency. And we're going to use this to coat our cinnamon rolls. Cinnamon rolls are cooled, put on the cooling rack, and we have our fondant glaze nice and ready. If it's been sitting a while, make sure you just give it a good mix before you start to put it over it. And we're just going to layer it over the top. All right, hope all of you like this video. You learned how to make delicious cinnamon rolls. Now, if you'll excuse me, it's time to eat.